At this late hour of the afternoon, thank you for inviting me and for having this presentation here. If you feel the need to get up, stand in the back or the side of the room, please feel free to do so. I'm a pretty casual person. In the late afternoon, it can be a little bit tough, so you won't offend me, and I appreciate your, I'm a big fan of pacing for concentration purposes. Conflict of interest and disclosures. We're funded by, about 2/3 of our funding comes from private family foundations, the Arnold Ventures, Templeton Foundation, Sloan Charitable Trust, and Hewlett. We have who have missions to increase trust and credibility in scientific research and in the evidence-based behind policy initiatives. I'll talk a little bit more about the work that our meta-science is funded by NSF, the National Institutes of Health, and as well as DARPA, a big project coming out in there. But our mission as an organization is to increase trust and credibility in scientific research through transparency. Before I get a little bit to how we achieve that, let me go through some of the issues we see that are leading to low rates of reproducibility. And so we see that there is a combination of factors that lead to some troubles. There's both a strong bias towards a certain type of result, a positive, significant, novel result, combined with flexibility in how data analysis occurs, or I should say undisclosed flexibility in how data analysis occurs. The combination of these two things leads to research that's not as reproducible as it should be. So a couple different pieces of evidence for both of those. The bias towards statistically significant findings is pretty well known through lots of studies. This is the largest data set I know of with several million papers across dozens of different disciplines showing the reported p-values of primary results reported in that literature, the vast majority of which, about 97% of which, is below that, of course, arbitrary threshold of that 0.05 p-value. So there's a strong bias towards those novel, significant, surprising findings. But there's also a way to look through data sets to find those novel, surprising findings. My favorite analogy for that is the so-called garden of forking paths, popularized by Gelman and Loken a few years ago. But what this describes is simply starting with a very basic research question. Is there a relationship between two things, between the control and treatment, or between two measured variables, whatever it is? And it starts out fairly straightforward and basic sounding, but operationalizing that research question involves dozens of different decisions. Each one of them represents a branch in decision making, and you quickly, and they empirically have shown, quickly lead to literally hundreds or thousands of reasonable analyses that can be conducted on fairly straightforward sounding research questions. How do you operationalize the independent and dependent variables? How do you include and exclude samples? How do you control for lots of confounders, time, age, weight, income, sex, whatever? And where, by chance alone, the way that the distribution of those probability values works is that a subset will be statistically significant by chance alone. We've seen this also with real data sets. This is one of the summary figures from a news article about a project that we call the Many Analysts Project, where 27 different teams of data analysts were given a research question. That research question was, is there a racial bias in how penalty cards are handed out in soccer matches? So they're given the same research question, and they were given the exact same data set. They went back to their teams, looked for the best way to analyze that data. They shared those data analysis plans with the other 27 teams. They revised those data analysis plans, and then they run the results. Each one of these bars, each one of these dots represents a result from one of the 27 teams. Those that lie along this horizontal line show no effect of racial bias. Those that are farther away from that horizontal line show a greater and greater effect. Same research question, same data set, 27 different answers to that question. Combination of these two things is one of the leading causes of irreproducible research. This is one of the summary figures from a project that we conducted about 4 years ago now, the reproducibility project in psychology. Took 100 previously published empirical research findings from the psychological research community, 97% of which were statistically significant, again, below that arbitrary threshold of 0.05. replicated each one of them with larger sample sizes in a pre-registered research design. I'll talk a lot more about the importance and process of pre-registration, but set the research plan down ahead of time before data collection started, tried to match it as close with the original methods and analyses of the original study, and the result was 37% of those were statistically significant in the same direction. We're aware of several other large or medium scale efforts to more systematically evaluate the reproducibility of published research. We know about roughly 200 replication studies that have attempted to look at this in a somewhat systematic way and find, with a lot of variation, a little bit less than half of published research can be quickly and easily replicated. But 200 out of the literally hundreds of thousands of studies published every year, these continue to be there continues to be a dearth of replication studies published. So we are often asked about solutions to the reproducibility crisis that I'll get into. But a lot of it does come down to encouraging, publishing, funding more of these replication studies to answer a lot of these empirical questions. So our mission to try to address this at the Center for Open Science is to increase trust and credibility of all published research in academic and in industry through transparency. We work to achieve that mission through 3 different major initiatives. So our meta-science activity is where we're best well known for some of these activities. These are the reproducibility projects in psychology, an ongoing one in cancer biology, recently finished one in social sciences, and we have a large project coming out that's DARPA funded called SCORE to systematically evaluate the credibility of research evidence with an attempt to extract 30,000 empirical claims from the published research literature and look for markers of reproducibility amongst those claims. Lessons learned from the reproducibility and meta-science projects go into our advocacy, community building, training, and incentive programs to better align ideal scientific practices, which is show me the data, show me exactly how you did it, with the actual research practices and the actual rewards that are faced for getting published, getting funded, getting hired and promoted. And then finally, our biggest team at the Center for Open Science is our infrastructure development team, who builds open source infrastructure to enable the types of actions for which we advocate. Study registration, project collaboration, data repository, workflow management, and preprint servers connected together in order to allow open and reproducible research. When I talk about open science practices, I tend to focus on 3 main activities. It doesn't so much get into what a lot of communities think of when I say open science. It's equated frequently with open access and being able to read those. We like open access, that's great. But the 3 main things that we tend to focus on are open data, making available to the greatest extent possible by ethics and law. The underlying data, when that's not completely possible, there are standards and best practices for sharing metadata and data availability. To the greatest extent possible, of course, again, within reasonable limits of ethics and legality, making the digital research objects publicly available or well documenting the physical research materials. And then finally, making a clear distinction between planned hypothesis tests and unplanned exploratory research by using the process of preregistration, which is, of course, you may know it's been required by law for about 20 years in the clinical research setting, but it's appropriate for all hypothesis testing research. And it's a major focus of our education with researchers. It's a major focus of how we address these issues with journal editors, research funders, and research institutions. But it's a key way to increase credibility by specifying in advance how data will be collected and analyzed. And it includes a time-stamped research plan that's created before the study takes place, usually before data collection starts, but with observational research using existing data sets, the preregistration takes place before access of that data set. And it's submitted to a public registry, perhaps embargoed, perhaps publicly immediately, but eventually it does have to become public. The preregistration contains the study plan, and most preregistrations should also include an analysis plan in order to make that clear distinction between planned analyses and unplanned exploratory or discovery research. And that's really one of the most important points about preregistration that we advocate for, is to make a clear distinction between confirmatory hypothesis testing research and exploratory hypothesis generating research that deserves to be confirmed. It's not about making one of those more or less important, it's about making that clear distinction between them. When you're in the context of confirmation, we think about traditional hypothesis testing. We think about results being held to very high standards of credibility and rigor and minimizing false positives when you're in that mode of research. And the result of confirmatory, purely confirmatory research is using traditional null hypothesis significance testing, which is still pretty ubiquitous in most published literature, is a p-value that retains its diagnostic value, retains the meaning that it should mean. Contrast that with discovery research is to push knowledge into new areas, find something completely unexpected. You want to minimize false negatives in this mode of research. Obviously, one does not want to miss the next penicillin or any other discovery, but it's not confirmatory research. The probability of observing a collected data set in that mode of research doesn't quite make sense. Even though those statistical tools are commonly used in that mode of research. And so preregistration is designed to create a distinct barrier between confirmatory and exploratory research. Unfortunately, we know that presenting exploratory research using the tools of statistical inference that were designed for confirmation makes the results look more surprising or novel than they really are, and it comes at the expense of their credibility. And we encourage preregistration for all traditional hypothesis testing research. Here's a couple of examples of some workflows. This is the most typical one. We have a very specific prediction derived by theory, or perhaps it's a replication and therefore a confirmation of a previously published or unpublished finding, but you have a strong a-priori prediction. Start with that, submit that to a registry, create that time-stamped immutable research plan, collect the data or access it if it's using an existing data set, follow the research plan that's in that preregistration to the T, follow the statistical analysis plan that's laid out within that preregistration. After that, the sky's the limit. Look for unexpected trends, look for unexpected differences between populations or groups, and the result of that is a hypothesis that, again, deserves to be replicated in a virtuous cycle. But it wouldn't be called research if we knew what we were doing, if we could always start out with that very strong, justified expectation. So when there are a few a priori expectations of how to work, that can be the basis of a bare bone preregistration. It's basically saying, I don't know what I'm quite doing here. I'm keeping a promise. I'm going to make a promise to myself that what's about to happen is purely exploratory and no inferences will be drawn from it. So state that on a platform somewhere. Collect the data. Split the data into two parts, keep half of it held off, unanalyzed in a different area. There are different recommendations for what proportion it has to be. Some will say it can be as low as 5 or 10% of the data set. Some will say it should be half. It depends on the size of the data set and a couple of implications about power. The only really essential ingredient here is that it's a truly random half of the data set, part of the data set. With the available data set, go to town on it, look for unexpected trends, analyze it in any which way makes the most sense. As you dig through it, let the data derive the analyses that will be most appropriate for it. Generate that specific hypothesis, create a preregistration with that specific hypothesis or that specific model that's generated through that process, and then use the held off data set. This is a workflow that's well known in a lot of machine learning algorithms. It's the test and validation data set, but it's appropriate for many modes of hypothesis testing work. The final held off data set can be used for that confirmatory phase. Researchers who are not in the clinical world basically never pre-registered. It's unheard of for lots of different communities. We have a registry, again, that open source online infrastructure is the Open Science Framework. We have as part of our education initiatives to help researchers know what are the important ingredients of creating a pre-registration. So these provide a couple of templated workflows to create a complete pre-analysis plan. So it walks the individual researcher through, all right, what are the hypotheses, what are the research questions, what are the very specific analysis plans, through about 20 to 25 questions. And at the end of that, there's a time-stamped read-only version of the research plan that can then be referred to after the study is completed. So when writing up the results of that preregistered work, the number one rule is to make sure that it's discoverable by providing a DOI or a URL to that registered research. Report the results of all pre-specified analyses. If there were 10 hypothesis tests, make sure to report all 10 analyses. Label any of the exploratory results or processes that took place. So oftentimes things will, as you start looking through the data set, it just makes sense that there's now another way to look at the data or another covariable to look at or confounding variable. Label those as results that deserve to be replicated and confirmed. And then include transparent changes document. No well-laid plan goes always according to plan. And so disclose those deviations that occur from what was pre-registered to what was conducted. There are a couple of different pieces of evidence we've seen pre-registration used in the clinical world for a long time, where the incidence of null findings are increasing because one explanation could be because it's constraining some of those researcher degrees of freedom for how analyses are conducted. Here's an example from the social science world where an organization called the Time Sharing Experiments in Social Studies was a service that is a service that allows researchers to submit research question surveys to a central repository, who then farms it out to a representative sample of US adults, collects the data, holds onto the data, and then gives it back to the submitting researcher. That's functionally a registry where you can compare everything that was collected to eventually everything that is being reported in the published literature based on data collected through this methodology. And so this is a summary figure showing the number of outcome variables that are being reported in the final articles compared to the number of outcome variables that are included, that were originally included in the questionnaire. Dots along the diagonal line here include articles that have the same number, precisely the same number of outcome variables included in the article as were included in the questionnaire. Fortunately, nothing ended up here where there were additional outcome variables showing up in the article. That would be fishy. But there are several studies here where there were outcome variables in the questionnaire that weren't reported in the article. That's not problematic by itself if for some reason there's no reason to report all of the outcome variables, if those that are being reported are a representative sample of those that are if there's no difference between what's being reported and what was being collected. But fortunately, the data were available for all of these articles and data sets, so the researchers in the study were able to look at the significance and effect size of the reported analyses. 122 reported tests, a median p-value, again, below that arbitrary 0.05 threshold. A median effect size, that's kind of a moderately sized effect size of Cohen's d, and 63% of the reported results were statistically significant, compared to the unreported analyses that had a median p-value of 0.35, half the median effect size, and 23% of those were statistically significant. The take-home message here is that all of these pieces of information, all these pieces of evidence were conducted in exactly the same way, but only a biased subsample of them were reported. So we don't have a representative sample of how the universe works that's being reported in the published literature for a variety of reasons, all coming down to publication bias. Coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally, the effect size is almost exactly half of what was reported from what was unreported. We see the similar things in these reproducibility projects. Very typically, the replication effect size is almost exactly half of what was originally reported. I like to call registered reports the process of preregistration on steroids, where it brings a couple of additional elements to how this process can be useful for researchers. It addresses publication bias, and it employs a way to get additional eyes on those protocols and on those pre-analysis plans. But registered reports is a publishing format in which those pre-registrations or those pre-study plans themselves become the subject of peer review. So that stage 1 peer review includes the introduction. It's submitted to the journal with proposed methods and analyses, and if there's any pilot data, that's included as well. And the reviewers will evaluate whether or not the hypotheses are well-founded, whether or not the methods and the proposed analyses are sufficiently detailed so that somebody else would be able to use them. Is the study well-powered? Underpowered study is another one of the leading contributors to irreproducible research. And very importantly, are there sufficient positive controls to confirm that the study is being conducted in a fair, positive way? So one of the major critiques against null results, and the major problems with null results, is you don't know if it's a null finding because the work was just done poorly, if the injection took place in the wrong spot, or if it's a true null, if there really is no effect there. The key ingredient here is that those rules for deciding when a null result is a true null, those quality assurance, positive control checks are established, and those criteria are established before results are known. So if the answers to all those questions are yes, then the editors can provide in-principle acceptance, a promise to publish the final outcomes regardless of the main findings of the study. The study is conducted, written up, stage 2 is submitted to the journal, and that stage 2 includes everything that was submitted at stage 1, plus obviously now the results and discussion, and if required, data and materials. At this stage, the reviewers are only evaluating whether or not the positive control succeeded, and are the conclusions being drawn, are they justified by the data? Very importantly, none of these things are allowed to come into consideration at that stage, at that second stage of peer review, whether or not the hypotheses were supported, or novel, or significant, or whether or not they'll have impact. So the advantages of the peer review format is that occurs when feedback can really have an effect on the study. It's one of the worst pieces of peer review is often quite good. It always improves the study. But the worst type of peer review that I've ever received is, oh, if only the author had thought of X beforehand, then it would have been a fair test of this hypothesis. And you're like, oh, 3 years of work. And so it occurs at a point in time when those types of feedback can actually influence the study design. It's more efficient because it avoids shopping around the article and waste author and reviewer and editorial time. And it's obviously more ideal. It focuses on what scientists care about, the questions and the methods, and it's a more collaborative process. Reviewers report enjoying the process more because it's constructive feedback as opposed to pointing out critical flaws that doom it to the dustbin. And we're seeing them become more and more mainstream. This is actually this is out of date. We have 201 journals that have adopted the format so far across different disciplines, and we have a growing database of journals that have adopted it and studies being published by it. And we're seeing them have the intended effect, starting to see them have the intended effects. So comparison of a comparison group of hypotheses supported in traditional versus registered studies, seeing high quality null results being more likely to be disseminated, a more accurate representation of how the universe actually works. I'm not a fan of the journal impact factor, but it is a measure of how journals compare themselves to each other, and I work a lot with editors who are worried that whether or not this is something that will tank the impact factor because they'll be publishing boring confirmatory research. Preliminary evidence suggests that published registered reports are cited at or above the average impact of the articles across the journal. So this is just one shown at one of the journals that has published a lot of these core texts. The editor there is Chris Chambers, who leads a lot of these initiatives at various journals. We have a curated resource hub for authors, editors, and reviewers at the website Center for Open Science /RR. I'm going to move a little bit quickly through this, but I just want to mention that one of our big initiatives is to incentivize these types of behaviors at the level of decision makers at journals, research funders, like ILSI and like the major publishers. So the top guidelines being piloted by ILSI, for example, are 8 policy statements for increasing transparency and reproducibility of published work. And they're designed to be agnostic to the research discipline, to be tiered for experimentation with and entry in different levels, and modular so that they can be picked up and used by different policymakers and institutions at different levels. I'll give a couple of examples of these, but the take-home message is they cover core parts of what is covered in the research studies, data, code, and materials. They talk about reporting guidelines and how to bring transparency to experimental and study design, as well as replication and study preregistration. This is one typical way that a lot of researchers or journals will implement the top guidelines. A couple of examples for what I mean by tiered is in the data sharing policy that a level 1 implementation of TOP would be a funder that says any research that's published based on the results of this funded work should state whether or not data are available. That's a pretty low tier, not very controversial, but it's, again, a little bit above status quo, which just merely encourages data sharing. A level 2 implementation of TOP, which ILSI is piloting with several funded studies, is that data must be posted to a trusted repository. And if there are ethical constraints to doing so, find the next best thing and provide some guidance on that. Level 3, not many journals are doing this. It does take a lot of additional work, but it is a reach goal that we've seen in about a half a dozen journals computationally reproduce the findings based on the collected data and the provided code. Again, it takes a couple of hours' time to do that for each one, but it's a high level of reproducibility. Likewise, for preregistration, there are a couple of different ways that policymakers at journals or research funders can engage with preregistration. Stating whether or not work was preregistered is a pretty basic disclosure requirement. Level 2 is a verification step that if the work was preregistered, somebody should check if the plan was carried out according to plan, and if not, were there transparent deviations. Or level 3, a requirement, if you're doing hypothesis testing work, it must be pre-registered. So the Open Science Framework is our open source tool to allow for collaboration and for collaborative research processes. It includes elements for data planning in a registry, data collaboration as a workflow management tool, and data deposition in a repository, as well as a connected preprint server. I'm going to run through a couple of different things, but simply a basic structure of an OSF project has narrative space for description of the project, free and limited file storage, and components or sub-projects to put in different parts of the data set. I'll go through that. I'm not even sure if I'm allowed to say this yet because the board hasn't voted on it. But yeah, tomorrow, okay. So ILSI might be engaging with this in some way. Stay tuned. I'm not even sure if I was supposed to disclose that because it hasn't been announced, but ILSI is working on different ways to have spaces on the OSF as well. So again, stay tuned. But here's one way that the OSF can be applied in an empirical research article. So this is one of the replication studies from the Cancer Biology Project. And it just includes very specific information for how the work was conducted, and for more information, see the data file, or see all the figures, or see all the images taken from this portion of the study at these short persistent URLs. So just that 5-digit GUID provides an easy way to provide in-text citations for that. And with that, I would be happy to stop and take any questions as we get ready for the happy hour in a little bit.